There were several dead civilians. And I mean, we're talking 10 to 20 or more strewn around this traffic circle. And they had been there for more than a day or a couple of days. Their corpses were already starting to decay and rot, and the stench was just unbearable, and they were in very contorted positions.
Smell of blood, blood and death. I hope nobody ever has to smell that.
This was such a different experience, and so many enemy involved, and they could have been right across the street from any building that we were in, and they were at that time. So there was that looming over us the whole time. All we could do was try to summon the strength to do what we were ordered to do and retake the city.
And we thought, holy shit, this is some big time stuff. And then we found out that it was the Tet Offensive, that it was going on all over the country.
Do you cry about every one of your friends and brother Marines that were killed? We didn't have that luxury. How do you deal with that on a daily basis? And what do you do with those emotions? What do you do with those feelings?
The voices you just heard, Larry Lewis, Dorian Dula, and Larry Ortiz, Marine Corps veterans who fought at the Battle for Hue and the war in Vietnam. They all have very different experiences and stories from the battle.
I was taking the magazine out to slam another one home. It was just breaking day. It was just dawn. It was still, not really bright yet. And there was a door that was open to the outside. And in that door was an NVA soldier with his rifle pointed right at me. They were always swarming around you, and we always had chocolate bars from the sea rations that we got. We'd try to give them that, and we'd give him anything we had, because we wanted, they were little kids, just like little kids. And for them to say we harmed them, that's always been set wrong with me.
This week marks 58 years since the battle started.
Every Marine wounded and every Marine that was killed, particularly if I knew them on a personal level, was like a knife through the heart.
This is Chapter 6 of our special series on the Battle for Hue and the Vietnam War. We call this chapter A Knife Through the Heart. We call this series The Battle That Changed Everything. My name is Josh Roe, and this is Tomorrowtown, Tennessee. John Lawrence woke up early and put on his boots and walked outside the McVie compound. He walked north toward Hue University. This was the 5th day of the battle, February 4th, 1968. He saw power cables and telephone lines hanging down across the street, chunks of concrete that were blasted off of buildings. There was a burned out 6x6 truck, furniture, bicycles, wet clothing, and paper all over the place. He wrote, quote, "The wreckage formed the landscape of a giant junkyard that included the bodies of several North Vietnamese soldiers lying in the streets, stiff and swollen." This is Larry Ortiz again.
The stench and the sickening stench of these smelling and rotting corpses throughout the city that we encountered everywhere we went during these days of the first days of the battle was horrifying. That's one of the strongest words I can use. And it just created this fear that, we didn't know if we were going to make it out of there alive at any second of the day while we were there.
And this is Larry Lewis from Alpha 11.
Same street that we would leave out of every day to try to go and get as much territory as we could back. A lot of times the NVA weren't able to get their wounded pulled back enough or get 2 of them. And you would watch bodies just deteriorate, just rot right there in front of your eyes day after day. And
they would leave the bodies in the street?
Yeah. We saw one where this guy had to be a Chinese. He was too big to be a Vietnamese. And
he was dead, and I watched his body just decay. After about a week, it was just falling apart and stuff.
So you'd be out there on patrol and walk past that same body over and over again?
Yeah, absolutely. And, the smell of blood, blood and death, I hope nobody ever has to smell that, but that's a terrible smell. And it was just permeating the whole area there. It was prevalent everywhere you went, There was just, you were seeing men being blown apart there, being shot in the arms, legs, and head. And, we ran out of field dressing packets to dress the wounds with, and our corpsmen were doing, a corpsman to me is he has the utmost respect and honor to me of any man, because they had one of the hardest jobs is whenever you get attacked and someone gets hit, you haul a corpsman up, and they have to get up and come to where you're at while you're maybe trying to grab Mother Earth there and try to get as low as you can. Here comes the corpsman. I saw times where they called corpsman up and I'd say, "Don't go, please don't go." But never saw a corpsman one time ever hesitate. Never.
It was a war zone, but these men had seen nothing but war zones since they arrived in Vietnam, and this was nothing like they had seen before.
So we were very bewildered as to what was going on, and our commanding officers from the company and our platoon commanders had no better idea than we did.
For the first few days of the battle, the Task Force X-ray commanders, who were about 8 miles away in Phu Bai, did not have a very good grasp of what was happening in Hue. But on the 4th day of the battle, February 3rd, readers of the New York Times back in the United States were beginning to understand. Mark Bowden, in his book Hue 1968, writes that Gene Roberts from the Times arrived in Hue late on day 2. And the first-hand report from the ground in Hue was in front of American readers on day 4 of the fight. That means a newspaper reader sitting in their kitchen would often have a better understanding of the battle than the Marines who were still being sent into this fight. For example, Nicholas Warr wrote in his book Phase Line Green that his Charlie 15 Marines arrived in Hue on February 11th, day 12 of the battle. This is Nick's company commander, Scott Nelson.
What did you know about Hue when you arrived there?
That's a great question. The intel we got was next to nothing, and it was nobody's fault because it was very chaotic. Politically, at the top, as I call in retrospect, the president and others were sort of suggesting that it was no big deal, that it would be over soon. And we heard that there was a company or so of NVA and Viet Cong, VC, holding the Citadel, and their flag was flying. And so we knew that to be true, and we heard gunfire, but we did not expect what we faced. We expected a quick skirmish, 3 days, no more, no less, go in there, clean it out, and leave. So what we encountered was tremendously different than the intelligence we received going in.
Again, Scott Nelson is a company commander, and he's arriving almost 2 weeks into the battle. This war was covered by journalists like no war before and no war since. And after a couple of days into the battle, word is spreading across South Vietnam that something big is happening in Hue. So those journalists start finding ways to get to the city.
So you're hearing a wounded Marine, trying to get him out of harm's way, and there are reporters everywhere?
They're in front of us, and we'd tell them. Finally, when we got to them, we had to push several of them away and said, "We've got to get him on the chopper because the chopper's there waiting to medevac him."
George W. Smith wrote a book called The Siege at Hue. He wrote, quote, "By 4 February, there were at least 50 members of the media scattered with the Marine forces in the southern section of Hue." Here's Larry Lewis again.
It was just wild at times to see. You'll see they would be running around everywhere. We're not even running, but they're running around like they knew what they were doing.
George Smith went on to write that before the battle ended, quote, close to 150 media personnel would visit the battle site, many such as CBS anchorman Walter Cronkite, flying in one afternoon and leaving later that day with his story.
It was like a school and a big, field, I guess like a soccer field or something. And we see all these cameras and a bunch of generals and colonels. And we saw the bright lights. And we saw Walter Cronkite. And we thought, holy shit, this is some big time stuff.
Walter Cronkite came to Hue City, and he was trying to get to Alpha 101.
He did. We talked to him.
Oh, you talked to him?
We sure
So
did.
you saw him?
Yeah.
So tell me about that experience.
Well, I wasn't one interview that he interviewed, but there were several of us that were hanging around there, and he was just asking us, how you feeling, what are your thoughts and stuff. We said, we're just wanting to survive.
Walter Cronkite aired his famous Report from Vietnam on February 27th. The battle officially ended on March 2nd.
With American sons in the field far away.
President Lyndon Johnson, March 31st, 1968.
With our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
President Johnson announced he would not seek re-election 29 days after the official end of the fight in Hue. There has been a story told for years, and I'll add, without much, if any, direct proof, that it was Cronkite's special that had a major influence on Johnson's decision not to run for re-election. And even if it was not the reason President Johnson didn't run in '68, he was well aware of the special and aware of the impact the broadcast had on the American public. This is another reason we call this series The Battle That Changed Everything, because in so many ways, this fight changed lives. Changed the lives of the men who fought there, their friends, their families. The battle also changed Marine Corps combat doctrine and training, and the battle for Hue changed the course of this country. I mentioned John Lawrence earlier. His role in the story of Hue City is interesting and significant. He's the one who wrote about the junkyard of bodies of Vietnamese soldiers outside the McVie compound. Lawrence, like Cronkite, worked for CBS News. Jack Lawrence arrived in Hue on the fourth day of the battle. It was Lawrence's stories from Hue that Cronkite was watching back in America, and Cronkite was presenting those stories to the 27 to 29 million CBS News viewers every night. For comparison, the top network news broadcast today on most days gets less than a third of that many viewers, roughly 8 to 9 million viewers. Jack Lawrence and the camera crew he worked with were Cronkite's direct access to the urban battlefield in Hue in those critical early days of the fight. Years after the war, John Lawrence wrote a book, The Cat from Hue, about his experiences in Vietnam. It was his reporting in Hue, along with Gene Roberts of the New York Times and others, that in part led Walter Cronkite to visit the city during the battle. Lawrence came to Hue from Phu Bai on a convoy on February 3rd, the same convoy that brought Lieutenant Colonel Ernie Cheatham into the fight at Hue. Lawrence interviewed Big Ernie Cheatham on the morning of February 4th.
Colonel Cheatham, what's the objective and what are your men about to do?
Well, I've got two companies here that are just about to clear the next 2 blocks up.
Lieutenant Colonel Big Ernie Cheatham earned legendary status for what he did at Hue, but had a fascinating life and career before and after Vietnam. He served in Japan and Korea during the Korean War. then left the Marines to go play football in the NFL for the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Baltimore Colts. That was in 1954. He returned to the Marines the next year, serving 35 years total and retiring as a 3-star general. But back to Vietnam. The last days of January 1968. Lieutenant Colonel Cheatham and 3 companies of his 2-5 Marines were fighting south of Phu Bai around the Troy Bridge. Jim Hunter from Hotel 2-5 was there. At the time, he had never heard the words Tet Offensive, but he will never forget how Tet started.
So they hit Bridge 1 and 2, and we ran up to Bridge 2. I mean, it looked like the 4th of July. And then we ran up to Bridge 1. And then, it got daylight. And then we thought, well, everything's over. But it wasn't. I think a helicopter zooming over spotted some North Vietnamese. I turned the woods on the left, and so he's into it with them.
That was the early morning hours of January 31st. Later that day, one of the companies fighting around the Troy Bridge, Fox 2-5, was pulled away from the fight, first sent about 5 miles north of Phu Bai, then helicoptered into Hue. The next day, Colonel Cheatham, his command group, and another one of those companies, Hotel Company, they were all pulled away from the fight at the bridges.
We went to Phu Bai, and then the next morning we went into Hue.
We got outside of Hue City.
As we moved on in, there was a big, huge fountain. I remember that fountain.
Everything was eerily quiet.
And we went to the right, go around the fountain.
I was saying to myself, I said, this is not good. We don't need there's something not right.
Bob Meadows, Jim Hunter, and Alpha 1-1's Larry Lewis were all in that convoy.
It hadn't gone maybe 200 feet, and boom, the truck in front of me blowed up.
The convoy was stopped.
All heck broke loose.
There are several written accounts that tell the story of what Lieutenant Colonel Cheatham found when he arrived in Phu Bai on February 1st. This is what Eric Hamill wrote in his book, Fire in the Streets. Quote, Cheatham was appalled by the level of confusion and panic he found. Hamill also wrote that Big Ernie Cheatham thought he'd be going away with Hotel Company, then learned he was not part of that convoy. So that night, he took advantage of a rare luxury, a full night to prepare for the fight that would define many of these Marines' experiences of fighting in the war in Vietnam. Ernie Cheatham had never fought his way through a city before this and had never sent another Marine to go fight in a city. This is more of Colonel Cheatham's conversation with John Lawrence on February 4th.
I've got one company in this big building here that I guess it's the end of the Hue University, and they are going to start firing in support of Foxtrot Company, which will be going up this road here on the left and attempt to take a couple large wall buildings that are on up about 500 or 600 meters.
What kind of fighting is it going to be?
It's house to house and from room to room.
Kind of inch by inch.
That's exactly what it is.
Now, you might remember in our past episodes, we talked about the restrictive ROE, the rules of engagement. Here's Larry Lewis again.
The first few days were just constant fighting. And you would try to, each day, go out and try to take a little territory, but, you'd get so far, but then you'd fall back and they'd reclaim it. And they didn't want to destroy it, but they were destroying us. So we weren't allowed to use artillery or air support.
On that night of February 2nd, Colonel Cheatham pored over every field manual he could find to understand what he would need in Hue.
Before that, we were having to go door to door and you throw as many grenades as you could in there, and then you had to go on in there and see what was left.
This is Hamill again, writing what Cheatham learned that night. Quote, the best way to fight through a city was to gas the enemy, blow things up, then clear out the ruins. Close quote. So Cheatham told his command group Marines to find what they could use to do just that. And on the convoy into Hue on February 3rd, Big Ernie Cheatham took with him, among other things, 106 millimeter recoilless rifles, plus tear gas grenades, flamethrowers, and 3.5-inch rocket launchers.
We got that recoilless rifle on that little mule, and we started just blasting the buildings apart, So that helped us a lot. It helped keep down some of the casualties, but the casualties were just unbelievable.
Cheatham arrived in Hue in the early afternoon of February 3rd. He met with his company level leadership to discuss how to take back the south side of Way. Starting that afternoon and for the following days, they put Lieutenant Colonel Cheatham's plan into action. Here's Larry Ortiz again.
Fox Company and Hotel had joined us in the battle, and they were, since they were a full-strength company at that time, which Golf Company was no longer because of the number of KIAs and wounded Marines we had already taken. So they took the lead in certain areas, trying to start the clearing of the south side of the city.
Also on the 3rd, South Vietnam's military leaders lifted the firepower restrictions on the south side of Way. And by this time, Bravo 11 Marines had joined the Alpha 11 Marines in Way. It was their job to clear the left flank of Colonel Cheatham's 2-5 Marines. It was in that fight on February 4th that Alpha 11's Sergeant Freddie Gonzalez was killed in action.
He was firing laws. They were rocket-propelled grenades. And I saw a flash come out of the window that I was firing at.
They turned around and fired an RPG back at him.
I knew it was a rocket. So I yelled to my guys, the rocket, get down. So we got down, the rocket arced low and hit G.
Hit him right in the chest.
I could hear him moaning, calling for help, and I started screaming for the corpsman. Doc Okonski got to him, and he was gone. That's a hell of a loss.
You can find much more of that story in the last episode in this series. I have a link to that in the show notes. With 1-1 on the left flank, the 2-5 Marines went to work clearing out the south side of Way.
The night of the 4th, we actually slept in the university compound itself. I, myself, with my platoon, slept in a science lab of some sort, and there were lab tables and a concrete floor. Trying to sleep on a lab table that's hard or the concrete floor that's hard was impossible. So another night of no sleep.
On Colonel Cheatham's right flank was the Perfume River. Elements of Golf 2-5, including Larry Ortiz, were sent to fight on the southern banks of the river.
Early that morning, our platoon was ordered out of the university buildings to our west, and there was a street between the university building and one street before there was a park and other buildings, and right after that was the banks of the Perfume River, which were running parallel to the road that we had to cross. So we exited the university, and at the end of the block of the university building, we were ordered to cross the road there, and there was a park on the other side of the building, had a low wall with a wrought iron fence, maybe about 3 feet tall. And as we tried to cross the street, we started receiving enemy fire from buildings to our west, to our left. And a couple of Marines had already been wounded and were lying in the road, and a tank had maneuvered toward these Marines and around them to try and protect them, and with cover from the tank where we could retrieve these wounded Marines and bring them back to safety. However, we were not ordered to help with that removal of these wounded Marines, as we were ordered to run across the street into the park across the street from us. And again, as we started, as individually, as we started crossing the street, we almost each one of us were fired at. Fortunately, I was not hit crossing the street, and the rest of the platoon and the company crossed the street, and we headed toward the banks of the river. Crossed the park, had to get over this wrought iron railing and low wall, again, while being sniped at. But we made it across there, went to the banks of the river, and were ordered west. And I didn't know where we were going, what our mission was that day, but afterwards I found out we were going to retake the hospital complex of buildings. There were several buildings, and that was our objective for that early morning. As we headed down the banks of the river toward the hospital, there was an open area and a rock wall about 3 feet tall, separating us from our current position and the hospital buildings. So I was with the 3rd Squad that day, and the 1st Squad headed out in a staggered column toward that open area. And as soon as they made it to that rock wall, they started receiving machine gun fire and a couple of RPG rounds. They were pinned down. A couple of Marines were wounded at that time. And I was ordered to a building that was close by us and on the banks of the river. And it was a terraced building with open terraces that faced toward the hospital complex of buildings. So I was ordered up to the 3rd floor where there was this open terrace. As soon as I exited the hallway up to that terrace, we had already been receiving heavy fire. I was hit in my right thigh, and I was spun around, and I fell behind a cement wall that protected me from being hit again at that point in time. Although I did still have my machine gun with me, I knew I had been hit. I didn't know how badly. I knew it was in my leg. I could see the blood, on my uniform, but I managed to scoot my machine gun up behind this. It was a concrete railing. There were 2 rails above there, but no wall. It was just concrete railing. So I managed to set up my machine gun. My A gunner collected many belts of machine gun ammunition, and I was able to start firing back on these buildings. And continued doing that for quite some time period. I don't know how many minutes, 15, 20 minutes. And we kept firing at the buildings, and we received as intense fire as we were firing on those buildings. We received it back with us, also receiving RPG rounds that exploded around us. And then some of the Marines around me noticed that I was bleeding quite heavily. So there had what we did is my A gunner was going to roll over the top of me while I rolled over to my left. He was going to assume taking over my machine gun and continue firing. Another Marine was going to become his A gunner, and I was able to crawl my way back to the opening that I had originally come up and get myself down into the heart of the building. And at that point in time, several casualties had been moved into the building, and they were set up an examination table on one of the pool tables in there and patching us up or doing whatever medical things they could do for us on that limited basis at that time inside the building. Later on that morning, we were those of us, the wounded that were ambulatory, and others that we could carry, went back to the university buildings where they had set up a larger first aid station. And we awaited helicopters to come into that park at the south side of the bridge that where our wounded were evacuated on that first night, or wounded and dead. And we waited for helicopters to come in later that day. Again, they could not land because of the heavy firing going on during the battles that were ongoing that whole day. So I think I made it out on a helicopter about between 3 and 4 o'clock that afternoon, after being wounded probably at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning.
That scene you described of the casualties on the pool tables and making a makeshift operation room there, I can only imagine the how surreal that felt in that moment.
It was, we are already taken a lot of casualties already, because as I say, the firing from those buildings were a large number of enemy troops with machine guns and automatic weapons. So we had already been taking quite a few casualties. And it was just mostly a triage area where they could only, apply bandages for the most part. Our corpsmen did have some IV bags for the those that were wounded more seriously than I was. So, yeah, it was, again, a day of pandemonium, frightened, terrified, just surviving on pure adrenaline, doing what we had to do.
What was your feeling leaving? I know that a lot of guys were wounded, tried to stay in the fight, even if they were wounded or not. You obviously had injuries too severe for that. But what was your thought when you realized I'm not in way anymore?
Well, it was very mixed. As a normal human being would feel, being out of a situation where you're at the verge of, on the brink of dying at any second during a very intense battle, that was a relief. That was no longer the case. I was in a safe area. So that immediately, brings you a sense of relief. At the same time, I knew the rest of my company, my platoon, my friends, my brothers, because that's what you become in situations of war situations where you rely on each other to have your back while you had theirs, do what needed to be done in a war and combat situation. So although I was glad to be out of there, it was very mixed feelings that I didn't necessarily want to be in the heat of a battle, but if that's where my company was and I was able to be there functioning in my job, that's where I wanted to be.
Explain this too, you're also, you're leaving very quickly. There's no time for any type of goodbye or that kind of thing. And I'm sure it was a long time. If some people maybe you never saw again. How did you process that people you were that close to, that you risked your life for every day, and then just separated like that?
That's an excellent question, Josh, and thank you for asking that, because you don't, for me personally, every Marine wounded and every Marine that was killed, particularly if I knew them on a personal level, was like a knife through the heart every single time. How do you deal with that on a daily basis? And what do you do with those emotions? What do you do with those feelings? Do you cry about every one of your friends and brother Marines that were killed? We didn't have that luxury. So all those feelings are just internalized during this whole time period that we are in Vietnam. And some of us, some did not do a full tour, which was for Marines, for whatever reason, was almost 13 months. After I returned from the hospital, I did go back to my unit and I completed 9 more months. So this goes on for a full year with these, deaths of your friends, serious woundings, and there was no time to process any of that to any resolution on an individual basis. So that was a pain. One of the most severe things that bothered me my whole time in Vietnam is losing so many friends, good men. And again, you become closer in many ways than you do to your actual blood siblings, because you're in a life and death situation and you depend on these people and you get close to them. And that makes the loss all more significant and heartbreaking.
Again, that's Larry Ortiz, machine gunner, 3rd Platoon, the Golf 25 Marines. The battle that changed everything is reported, produced, edited, researched, and just about everything else by me, Josh Roe. We have one more episode for season 1 of this series. Then we'll take a break and we'll be back late summer of 2026 with a brand new season of stories all about the battle for Hue and the war in Vietnam. I'll have more details about season 2 coming soon. Most of what I understand about the battle I learned directly from the men featured in this telling. I have also listed all the texts and other materials I quoted or studied for background information on this series, and that list of books and information continues to grow. You can find that list of resources at newschannel9.com. There's a link to that in the show notes of this episode. The Battle That Changed Everything is a special series and is part of our podcast, Tomorrowtown, Tennessee. This podcast is a production of News Channel 9, Fox Chattanooga, and Sinclair Broadcast Group Chattanooga. I hope you join me again real soon.